Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulil Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Amma ba'd. So Alhamdulillah, Allah graced us to begin another week 2 of this class on the principles of Tafsīr from a great scholar, Imam Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi, rahimahullah ta'ala. So part 3, we're going to look at a little bit, take a look at the world of Shah Waliullah. Last week we discovered, we introduced Shah Waliullah himself by sharing some facts about him, 3 key facts that you need to know in order to understand his thought and his scholarship and his writing. We introduced a text that he wrote, and we began to read it. We began reading the Muqaddimah, and we completed the first paragraph. So, as I mentioned, there are a couple of new people. Every class will have an introductory side, and then we'll be looking at the text. So, continuing our introduction, now we want to look at, in order to try to understand the time period that Shah Waliullah lived in. We shared last week the 4 surprising contemporaries of Shah Waliullah, just to give you a snapshot of what was happening in the world. You mentioned Aurangzeb, the Mughal ruler, George Washington, the first president of the United States, Isaac Newton, and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. So not to go into that again. Now, in terms of looking at his life, from the time of his birth until the time of his death, what was happening. So one of the things, you need to get accustomed to in order to understand anybody's life, any great scholar that you're studying, you begin with dates. You begin with the obvious, who they are, and you begin with when they were born and when they died. Generally, the date that a scholar died is more prominent and important in Islamic scholarship. So generally, most scholars identified with the date that they passed, just as a uniform convention. So you'll see Imam al-Dhahabi in parentheses in the year that he died. You'll see Imam al-Suyuti's name, and in parentheses, died the year 9/11, for instance. So Shah Waliullah, let me tell you the first thing about him. He was born in Shawwal in the year 1114 of the Islamic calendar that corresponds to February 21st, 1703 in India. So just that one piece of information I gave you, 1703 he was born. So from that, you can start, digging into your knowledge of history. You can start investigating, okay, what was that time period? Just from the year, you know a lot. So 1703, this is a map of the world, the Muslim world at least. So what was happening in 1703? I mean, what did the world look like? What did the countries look like? So let me open up the floor. What do you think? So I mentioned those 4 individuals, but 1703, what did you have in the world at that time? In terms of the nations and the states or politics, what did the map look like?
There was no America yet.
Yeah, there was no America yet, sure. But we're concerned on this side of the world, right? So that's the Western Hemisphere. What about the East? This was the center of the world at the time, yes.
The Ottomans were in decline?
Yeah, before the decline, the Ottomans were there, right? Let's say that. So this was the time of the Ottoman Empire, okay? So yeah, there you go. Here's the first block for you. The Ottomans were a big chunk of the map at that time. They were the reigning power over much of this region, at least. What else was going on? So 1703, what did other regions look like? So the Ottoman Empire, yes, that's very important.
Much of Africa was colonized and Asia was colonized.
Okay. When did colonization begin?
Depends on the country. India was actively, the East Indian Trading Company was.
Well, that was after this, right? That was probably mid or to late 1700s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like pre-colonial era, right? This is 1700s, is very early still. The 19th century was a freedom era. The countries were getting their independence. 20th century and late 19th century. So the 18th century was a colonization century in the early 19th. The 1700s is the beginning of the 18th, so it hasn't really happened yet, I think. So the Ottoman Empire. What about countries? So what else? What did Europe look like at that time?
No bats.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. But like we're talking about maps.
Spain and Portugal were one, I think, at that time.
Yeah. So I mean, when were the Muslims kicked out of Spain? 1492. So this is well after that, right? So Spain now is under Christian control. There are kingdoms. So there are various kingdoms in Europe. It's not united yet, but there's a lot of different nations and kingdoms. What about the Muslim world? Let's finish the Muslim world. The Ottomans. Was there any other empire in the Muslim world? Were the Ottomans ruling over every?
Safawiya.
Safawiya. So Safawiya is so where is the Safavids or the Safavid Empire?
It's Iran.
In current day Iran, yeah. So Persia, that area was controlled by the Safavid Empire. So this was active at that time. That was it, and they were totally. They're not under the Ottomans. They're the rivals of the Ottomans, right? So the Safavids, the Ottomans. What else in the Muslim world? You had another empire. What about where Shah Waliullah is from? Let's go to his area. Yeah, it was the Mughal Empire, right? So you had Europe, and then you had India. India was the Mughal Empire, right? So you had these. This is what the map of the Eastern Hemisphere looked like, at least this area. We're not dealing with China or the Far East. So you had the Mughals ruling over India. You had the Ottoman Empire of most of the Muslim world, except for the Safavids were in Iran. And then Europe, the nations were just starting out and establishing themselves.
Didn't the Mughals, weren't they ruling from pretty much a lot of Asia?
No, the Mughals were only in India. So India at that time was divided into Pakistan and Bangladesh and Afghanistan. So India was like that whole, subcontinent that extended into Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan. But that was the only place the Mughals ruled. They didn't rule much else. So it was a very local empire.
I'm thinking of further out in the hinterland.
No.
No, I'm thinking of not the Mughals, but
that's the Ottomans right now, right?
No. So, but who was opposing the Ottomans?
Opposing the Ottomans were always European powers, so Russia and a lot of the European states, France and Italy. And then in the Muslim world, it was the Safavids. So the Safavids were always attacking the Ottomans in like that central.
They had not embraced Islam yet.
The Safavids?
Yeah.
No, they were Shiite.
They were Shiite.
So it was a Sunni and Shiite battle. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So I just wanted to draw a map of the world. The Ottomans, Safavids, Europe, and India. Okay? So just, you can see, so this is to draw the whole timeline of Shah Waliullah's life. So 1703 he was born, and he died in 1762. So these are two key pieces of information you need to keep in mind. For any scholar, the date of birth and death is very important. So Shah Waliullah, whenever you read his life, his books, always keep that in mind. 1703 to 1762. That always helps situate things, and when you're discussing ideas of who influenced who, is very important. Okay, so now let's just give you a little bit of history. Break down the Muslim world now. So here is a map this is an image, a picture of the conquest of Istanbul or Constantinople, right? So let's talk about the Ottomans for a bit, okay? The Ottoman Caliphate, the Ottoman dynasty. So the Ottomans were very, very interesting people, or the Turkish people, the Turkic peoples. The Ottomans, before we get into their history, it's nice to look at the whole legacy of a people or a nation, just to see what they did, just to have an idea, and then you can really make sense of their history. So the Ottomans, you need to know, that was the last caliphate, right? That was the last major Muslim empire. Not only that, they were the longest surviving Islamic dynasty. No other Muslim dynasty or empire or caliphate lasted that long. Not the Umayyads, not the Abbasids, not the ones that came in between. The Ottomans in the Muslim, they have the honor of being the longest standing, caliphate or state. We can use that term. They ruled over 3 continents. They united the whole Muslim world. So there was the largest empire in terms of all the Muslim empires we've had. And they ruled from, you have the dates here, yes. They were established in 1299, right? And all the way up to 1922, sorry. Ottomans were abolished in 1922 by Kemal Atatürk, right? So that's, modern history, That's the time of our grandparents. That's the time, around that time my grandfather was alive, he was just born. So there might still be people alive that witnessed that. I mean, there are very few, like they're passing away, but if anyone's over like 100 years old, they might have seen this time. So the Ottoman Empire lasted from 1299, which is very early, all the way till the 20th century. So that's significant. You can see that somehow Allah bless these people and this group to have such a long reigning control of the Muslim world. Not only that, it's even deeper than that. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that kind of sheds light on things. It's a sound hadith according to many scholars. It's not in Bukhari or Muslim, but it's among the 6 books. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "La tuftahunna, you shall conquer, or you shall open." I don't know if I have the translation. No, I don't. La tuftahunna al-Qasṭanṭīniyya, you will open Constantinople.
For sure, right?
Yeah. So you will conquer Constantinople. You will open Constantinople. And then he praised the group that will do that. فَلَنِعْمَ الْأَمِيرُ أَمِيرُهَا. What a great leader that will be. This is the words of the Prophet. وَلَنِعْمَ الْجَيْشُ ذَلِكَ الْجَيْشُ. What a great army that army would be. So, ever since this hadith was there in our books, and this hadith predates, so it's sound, because some people might argue, okay, going back, it's something people invented, but this is part of the 6 books that's way before the conquest of Constantinople, right? So it was already written in our tradition. So many people thought about this, and how many rulers and empires and people must have struggled to be part of that. But the Ottomans are the ones who did it all the way in 1453. 1453 was the conquest of Constantinople by Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih, Muhammad II, one of the Ottoman rulers. So just that will give you an idea. The last empire of the Muslim world, when the Muslim world fragmented, they were there. And then they're the ones that our enemies destroyed, dismantled to destroy the Muslim world. And there's a hadith about some of their leaders. So it's something, they have this blessing, this great renown. So the Turks in Islamic history, there's Adam Silverstein, he wrote Islamic History, a very short introduction. So he said something interesting about the Turks. He said about the Turks, he said the Turks' involvement in Islamic history is full of surprises, almost all of which are pleasant. So that's a very interesting thing, because that's really what defines the Turkish people. They're full of surprises. I remember when I was doing a minor in political science back in the 90s in college. At that time, Turkey did not have a huge role in the Muslim world. It was still a very secular, staunchly secular republic. It was still Atatürkish, right? So I was discussing with a graduate student colleague of mine, and we were talking about Turkey. At that time, Turkey was, the best description of Turkey was, it was a big question mark in the Muslim world. And just the history that it had, and it was just silent. So I remember one of my colleagues said that, Turkey is going to surprise you. And that's really going back for thousands of years. That's how you describe the Turkish people. They're full of surprises. So Adam Silverstein, he talks about, he says the first surprise is that they're involved in Islamic history at all. So what does that mean? That means, what's the origin of the Turkish people? Right? What are they?
Step one.
No, they're not European. They're from the steppes. It's the opposite of Europe. So
We're talking about the Balkans and whatnot.
No, even farther. Let's see if I have a map here.
What are the steps?
Okay, let me.
Vast seas.
Okay, I mean, we don't have the full map here, but
Turkmenistan area.
the Turkish, it's not, the Turkish people are not one homogeneous group. There are a lot of nomadic tribes that fall under the Oghuz. So they're derived from the Oghuz tribe.
Oh.
And the Oghuz was the original tribe that came from Mongolia.
Yeah.
So if you're looking in the map, you have to kind of tilt the globe. This is China right here. North of China is the Atlas Mountains, and there's the Mongolian region, the steppes. That's where this tribe is from. So the Turkish tribes, they're part of this whole Central Asian region. Right now you have Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkey. All these are descendants of Turkish tribes. But none of them came from, they all came from like very far away. So they had to go all the way through like Russia and all these lands to get here. So that's the first surprise about the Turkish people. So there were a lot of different tribes. So from the Oghuz tribe, you had so many branches. So basically, you have to understand tribal nomadic culture. When you're a warrior nomadic tribe, you have one chief, and you have a whole group of families that coalesce around one chief. And then you have different tribes that are kind of roughly related. Each one stays in their own neighborhood. And they always live on the outskirts of civilization. So they're not in the centers of the city, they're always in the outskirts. So they were north of China and Mongolia. Then when they migrated, they would come into like these nomadic areas where there's no civilization. So there were a number of prominent leaders over time. So one of them was Alp-Arslan. So he established the Seljuk Empire. So he was also from the Oghuz. So from the Oghuz, you had the Seljuks. Also the Mamluks, most of their soldiers were Turkish. So that was also one of their tribes. Also the Mughal Empire in India is derived from that as well. So many dynasties were born out of the Turkish people. So the first surprise is that they came from so far away and they populated the whole Muslim world so rapidly. And the second surprise is that they dominated the Muslim world and they contributed to it. And many of the dynasties after the Abbasids were Turkish dynasties. So from the Ayyubids, the Mamluks, Seljuks, then you had the Ottoman various tribes. One of the tribes was the Kai tribe, right? That's the tribe in the show that we all watch, right? So that's a descendant of the Oghuz tribes. They're all related. This is from that same time period. And then they established themselves. And then even the Safavids had Turkish origins, although they went in a different direction. So that's really interesting about the Turkish, various Turkish groups. Now, going back to the Ottomans, so what's the history of the Ottomans? So I was reading this book from my library. I've had it for many years, but there's something that might surprise you. So just like a little piece of history. I just wanted to read a direct quote instead of summarizing. Okay, so the ancestral homeland of the Turkish people was the grassland of Mongolia in East Asia. The first Turks to arrive in present-day Turkey were the nomadic Seljuk tribes, led by Alp-Arslan in 1071, the year in which the Byzantine Emperor was defeated at the Battle of Malazgirt. And then he continues, Seljuks who remained in Anatolia established their own dynasty called the Seljuks of Rum, whose capital was Konya. By the end of the 13th century, the Seljuk state had weakened after the Mongol invasions of Hulagu Khan and were divided into many principalities. Many of these nomadic Turkish tribes had entered Seljuk territories years before. One such group of nomads was the Soghut tribe, and the Soghut is another name of the Kai tribe, who settled near the Sakarya River in western Turkey. When his chief, Ertugrul, died in 1280 or 1281, his son Osman became the leader. This is an old history book, so this is history. There's a great Netflix series that a lot of people are watching called Ertugrul. It kind of depicts the rise of this particular chief. So that's an amazing show. I highly recommend it. It gives you a sense of how the world was at that time. And
Where is it played?
It's produced in Turkey because it's about the founders of the Ottoman Empire, right? But it's set in 1250. The starting date is 1252, I think. The first scene starts in 1252. So this is pre-Ottoman. It's on Netflix.
Netflix?
Yeah. It's also on YouTube. I think YouTube also has it.
It's called Resurrection After.
Resurrection?
Yeah, Resurrection After. One thing I was thinking about was that, so the modern day Turks also, they look very, Caucasian, European. And I was thinking that it's because since the original Turks look more like what the Uyghur look like, right, in Xinjiang?
Well, the thing, so what do you mean by original Turks? Like, originally, there are a lot of different tribes that came out of that region, right? So, there's never a homogeneous thing here. So
because I figure with the mixture with the Janissaries, the European slaves.
Yeah. So, what happens over time when nomads travel, they all, they interact with local civilizations, they marry, and things do change. But, there isn't one, even their languages, there are a group of Turkish languages that fall into the Turkish language family. It's not one family, right?
Yeah, I have Turkish friends, and I have some old Turkish friends, actually. And they look like a lot of the people from Mongolia.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of them look like people from Mongolia and whatnot.
So, I mean, just the idea that Turkish look like Europeans, a lot of them do, but a lot of them don't. So it's not a, yeah, because, so Anatolia is like east, right? It's in Asia, right? So Anatolia is where the Ottoman Empire was based. So this is 1252 is where the show is set, right? And 1299 is the official date given of the start of the Ottoman Empire. That's the son of Ertugrul, right? So when he established himself in Bursa, and Constantinople fell 1453, so 200 years later. So from 1453, the Ottomans entered on the European side. So that's probably where a lot of these features came in, and a lot of those people that were living there. So,
what religion were they originally? Buddhist?
So originally they were shamans, and there were a lot of different faiths. So some of them Christians, some even adopted Judaism, but most of the faiths were shaman. So even the Mongols are related to them, right? The Mongols, like Genghis Khan, they worshipped like the great blue sky, and they were shamans. So even to this day in that area, there are a lot of people who are shamanist. They follow shamanistic religions. So so the Ottomans are very interesting. So it all starts with, officially everyone says it started with Osman Ghazi, right, 1299. But we know, how do you get there? His father, Ertugrul, he's probably the real founder if you really go back in time. And even, to decide who a founder is, that's really politics, because no one starts from a vacuum or scratch. You're always standing on the shoulders of someone else, right? So you always can go back in time and keep on going back to find, who the real person who's the founder is. But, officially, generally, Osman Ghazi was the one. Ertugrul was a great warrior. He established his tribe. He fought his enemies, and they were able to establish themselves in Anatolia. And then his son, Osman Ghazi, he really conquered a lot of land and established himself in a region called Bursa. That's where his grave is today. So they were still leading his tribe, and his tribe was the Kai tribe. And then when he died, his son, Orhan Ghazi, he basically went into the European side and he conquered so many regions. And he changed the name of his tribe to the Osmanli. And that's where the name Ottoman comes from, the Osmanli tribe. And then one of his descendants, I think it was his son, he declared himself, once they had so much territory that he declared himself Sultan and the Khalifa. And then basically from there, they're just ruling the Muslim world. There's no other power, in opposition to them. So 1453, great important date to know, the conquest of Constantinople. It was conquered by Sultan Muhammad Fatih. So he's a descendant of Osman Ghazi, descendant of Ertugrul. And his goal was to reunite the Roman Empire. So and that's a great battle. That's something, it's probably the greatest battle fought in the history of man. In terms of how they conquered, they brought their ships over the mountains to conquer, this fortress. Istanbul is like surrounded by the sea, right? So it was an incredible feat, and they conquered that. And he kept going eastward, and his goal was to take all of the Roman Empire, reestablish it, with an Islamic flavor. And he almost took all of Italy. So he was so close to taking all of Italy. So his goal was to have, so all of Europe today would have been Muslim. So that was the vision that he had. But Allah has His own decree. But still, it's a great account. They went to the gates of Vienna, so like half of Europe was under the Ottomans. And then the golden age was the 1500s, and then 1700s were great. And then by the time Shah Waliullah is born, 1703, now the Ottomans are beginning to decline, right? So just wanted to set the stage here, okay?
Decline in what sense? Just
in terms of not being strong, not being homogenous, there's a lot of infighting, civil war, a lot of times of weakness, emphasis on materialism, all these things. So when you find that in a people or a nation, emphasis on, being not tolerating dissent, for instance, being oppressive on their people, being the rulers being cut off from the masses, these are all signs of decline and weakness. No nation survives very long in those situations. So when you look at and you study the rising nations like the Ottomans at this time, they're united. They have a vision. They believe in da'wah and things like that. Not all of them, but generally that's the case. But when a civilization is on the decline, they're emphasizing dunya. You'll find rulers building palaces and mausoleums and palaces, spending millions of dollars building these great structures. And while the nation is collapsing, people are starving. So that's a sign of decline. Of course, you won't know it at that time. It's just going back, you can kind of analyze. Okay, from the 1700s, I'll show you some facts why that's considered a decline. Okay, so coming back to the Muslim world now, let's look at the Safavids. So the Ottomans are the bulk of the Muslim world. The Safavid state. So this was established. Do I have some dates? Okay, I don't have it written down, but I'll tell you. The Safavid Empire ruled from 1501 to 1722. 1501 to 1722. Okay, so it's a regional empire. It's not a global empire. It was initially a Sunni Sufi order led by a ruler by the name of Safiuddin, who died in 1334. So Safiuddin, that's where the name comes from. He was based in Azerbaijan, right? And they're also, a Turkish nomadic people. Something happened. One of their people was killed. He was a powerful ruler, Sheikh Haidar. And then his son his name was Ismail. He was 13 years old. And he wanted to avenge the death of his father. So he basically, at the age of 13, he basically conquered various tribes and regions, and he took the city of Tabriz. And then he proclaimed himself Shah. So Shah Ismail is the first Safavid ruler. And then when he became the ruler, for some reason he suddenly adopted Shiism as a faith. And he proclaimed to the people that he's a descendant of Ali through Fatima, a descendant of the Prophet through Ali and Fatima. And he's Ahl al-Bayt, to appeal to the Shia side. And he also claimed to be of Sassanid royal blood, the Persian Empire, right? So his vision, his idea was to reunite the Persian Empire, right? So the Persian Empire or the Sassanid Empire, that's the proper name, was the empire that the Muslims conquered, right? Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, and it collapsed. Qisra was the ruler. So from that time, the people are still there. They're all Muslim now. But then he wanted to reunite that region with a different flavor, and he adopted Shiism as a faith. And he basically he managed to take key cities and he established himself in that region that's current-day Iran. And then his descendants, basically over time, the ruler after him and the ruler after him, they started converting people to Shiism forcefully. So they basically decimated the Sunni populations, and they destroyed Sunni masjids and institutions of learning. And over several hundred years, the whole region was forcibly converted to Shiism. And from that time until today, that's a center of Shiism. Today, Iran is all Shiite. Basically goes back to the Safavid era, right? So when they established themselves, the Ottomans were there, right? So they're always against the Ottomans because there was always a Sunni Shia dynamic in the Muslim world, unfortunately. So they capitalize on that. You could argue that, the reason he chose Shiism just to go against this empire, because, ruler, it's all about politics and agendas. They adopt policies and things that suit them. So Safavids were always rivals to the Ottomans. They were always fighting. There were several hundred years they were fighting each other back and forth. It was like a Cold War. So 1722 is when the empire collapsed, and then there was a lot of other things happening at that time. Now Europe, what's happening in Europe at that time? Britain is coming out of a period of civil war, and now it's a united political power. It has a strong navy. So the Industrial Revolution has happened. Enlightenment is happening in Europe. So now the Kingdom of Great Britain was born as a sovereign state in 1707. Same time period. 1703 is Shah Waliullah's birth, right? 1707, the Kingdom of Great Britain is born, and then you had Queen Anne, then King George the First, and King George the Second, King George the Third. And then in America, you had the first colonies, right? The first colonies were in the 1600s in Jamestown. But by 1703, the 13 colonies are already there. There's the Iroquois nation of the Native Americans. They're a strong power also. And you had George Washington as a young general. So a lot of things are happening in the West. But you can kind of see the Muslim world already lived this time, and it's on its decline. And the West, they're rising as powers and as nations. And colonialism is going to come next. Now, the Mughals, let's talk about India, the final piece of the puzzle. In India, you had the Mughal Empire. So Mughal is the same word as Mongol. So it comes from it's the same word. Mongol in Arabic is Mughul. And that's where Mughal comes from. Why? Because the founder of the Mughals was Babur Shah. In 1526, he founded the Mughal dynasty. He was a descendant of Genghis Khan from his mother's side, and a descendant of Timur Lang or Tamerlane from his father's side, a fifth generation descendant. This is all, so he's part Turkish, part Mongol, and they're all related anyway, ultimately, from Mongolia. So he was born, Babur Shah was born in Uzbekistan, in Samarkand. So, and at that time, there was his mother tongue was Chugtai Turkish. So Babur spoke Turkish, a version of Turkish. And the court language, the language of the scholars at that time was Persian. So basically, at that time, the Safavids were defeated by the Ottomans in 1514 in a great battle. And they said Babur is alive at that time. So he basically, he allied himself with the Safavids. So, this is Mughal history. Mughal history is not that, is very ugly for those who are proud of our ancestors. He allied himself with the Safavids, and he tried to retake Samarkand as a center under the Safavids, but he wasn't successful, and then he separated from them. Then he conquered Afghanistan. So he was kicked out of Samarkand, he conquered Afghanistan, he established himself in Kabul. And then from there, he always tried to go back to Samarkand, that's his birthplace, but he was never able to take it. He wasn't part of the Ottomans. So he was stuck in Afghanistan, and the only place he could go was further east, to a place nobody wanted to go, India. Right? So none of the Muslim empires ever went there. Earliest history, and we'll do a history of India, Islam in India in a bit, but in the time of Uthman, there are some reports that Uthman ibn Affan, radiallahu anhu, he would send people, the Sahaba would send people to different parts of the world to see, what was going on. And he sent people to India, and they came back and said, you don't want to go there, nothing's happening there. So then the Muslims ignored that for a while. And then, in Sindh, they had a stronghold with Muhammad bin Qasim for a while. But, so he was forced to go to India, he didn't want to go to India. And then he wound up, conquering India, establishing himself. He got stuck, he was kind of exiled in India. And then his son was the next Mughal ruler. The Mughals ruled from 1526 to 1858. 1526 to 1858. And that's where Shah Waliullah is born, in the Mughal Empire.
What's the dates again?
What is the dates are 1526 to 1858.
Just the entire dynasty?
Yeah. 1858 is the Indian Rebellion, the mutiny, right? 1857. So after that, the Mughals were still there, but like, and then they were kind of.
But Muslims were there before the Mughals.
Yeah. So Islam in India is a long topic.
Yeah.
The Mughals were just 1526,
So
18.
because
They were the last Muslim rulers of India, and they were the longest. Prior to that, it wasn't. Nobody lasted 200 to 300 years.
Consecutively, we ruled 720 years.
Yeah. I mean, but it was always fragmented. So it was never. The Mughals were the first one to unite all of India under one political power. Prior to that, it was never the case. Yes.
The Mughals ruled till 57 or 28?
No, 1858.
1858.
1857, when the British really started taking over. But, the end is always a very sad tale. The last Mughal ruler was basically just left in a city, and then the British finally let him stay alive for a while until they finally killed his children and put him on a bus, on a train, and said, get the hell out of here, basically. That's what they did with the Ottomans, too.
Yeah.
The last Ottoman ruler was, his family was imprisoned and killed, and then he was just placed on a train to nowhere. And anyway, so 1858 is the end of the Mughal Empire. So I don't want to do a whole history lesson, but here, this is the last slide I'll have on history. Just to, one way of gauging decline and stability is to see how many rulers you have, right? So just analyzing Shah Waliullah's lifetime, 1703 to 1762. How many rulers did you have Great Britain? You had Queen Anne, the first ruler, and this is the dates of her rule. Then you had King George I, and then King George II. That's the bulk of his lifetime up until 1760, right here. And then when Shah Waliullah, in the last 2 years of his life, George III was there for quite a long time. So you can see 3 rulers for most of his life in Great Britain. Now look at the Ottomans. The Ottomans, you had 5 different rulers. And Ottomans is a dynasty. It's not like every 4 years there's an election. So when in a dynasty, when you have multiple rulers, that means there's a lot of fighting going on, there's a lot of intrigue, there are people killing each other to take over. So you had, look at all the rulers, Mustafa II, Ahmad III, Mahmud I, Uthman III, Mustafa III. So the Ottomans, you had a lot of different, so this is a time of turmoil. You can say it's a time of political turmoil. The Safavids were even worse. So the Safavids were basically, they were decimated in his lifetime, but you had Shah Sultan Hussein, then Mahmud of Ghazna was a ruler in Afghanistan. He's not a Safavid, he came and destroyed them. He ended the Safavid empire. But just by this portion, what I mean is that region, who was in that region. So Mahmud of Ghazna, then you had the Safavid ruler Shah Tahmas, Nadir Shah, Karim Khan, Aga Muhammad Khan Kahar, right? Khan Kahar. So all these, some of them are like a few months old when they're rulers, and they're just like symbolic rulers. Some of them are there for 6 months, and so it's a lot of chaos. So the Muslim world is in chaos. Ottomans are declining, turmoil, Safavids are even worse. And then what's happening in the Mughal Empire? This is even more surprising. Look at the list of Mughal rulers in the lifetime of Shah Waliullah. Just in his lifetime, he saw Aurangzeb, Azam Shah, Bahadur Shah, Jahandar Shah, Farukh Siyar, Rafi' Darajat, Shah Jahan II, Muhammad Shah, Ahmad Shah Bahadur, Alamgir, Shah Jahan III. So how many rulers in the lifetime of Shah Waliullah, right? Almost a dozen rulers.